represent his disciples.
We are talking the movie Lords of Chaos. This one is directed by Jonas Åkerlund and stars Rory Culkin, brother of Macaulay Culkin. So this deals with the heavy metal scene in Norway, specifically the what's known as black metal, Norwegian black metal, and it tells a story of a few people within this kind of particular sort of subgenre who form a kind of a movement, the black metal movement. And we have this band called Mayhem, of which Rory Culkin's character Euronymous is part of. And he's this guitarist in this band Mayhem, who is becoming one of the kind of the originators of this kind of subgenre. And their whole thing is kind of an anti-establishment kind of approach with kind of like satanic kind of visuals ultimately. And it really tells a story of how this kind of movement got started and how the people really kind of just bought into ultimately their own kind of hype, and it becomes a dangerous game of one-upmanship where we have this kind of other character who is kind of tangentially related to the band and then kind of starts his own kind of thing, he is kind of Varg, his name is, and he kind of makes his own movement called Burzum, and they have this kind of dangerous kind of one-upmanship ultimately where they kind of want to seemingly kind of outdo each other in kind of shocking things and kind of to try and prove that they are, you know, true metal and all of this. And ultimately it ends up in a kind of a bloody murder, but along the way we have a very, very detailed suicide, we have another killing, we have burning churches and a lot of kind of dark and depraved behaviour along the way. So what do we think of this movie? So I didn't know this kind of movie, to be honest with you, really before I watched. I hadn't really heard much about it, but reading some of the reviews prior to doing this one, it's got a lot of criticism for not being accurate, for, you know, historically accurate to what actually happened. Now, I don't know personally what happened. I did read kind of the Wikipedia page to give me enough idea. It seemed like they kind of hit a lot of the kind of the right beats to me, but you know, maybe kind of some of the characterizations are kind of different in real life. Who knows? I can only judge, obviously, the film. I can't judge on what's happened in real life here. So we are only talking about the film and kind of my thoughts on it. And this is, I actually thought this was a pretty well-made film, to be honest. It's not going to be for everyone. This is a very dark and depressing kind of biography movie ultimately. It's sprinkled with a little bit of kind of black humour here and there to go with the kind of the black metal aesthetic, I suppose. But it is pretty violent in places, and kind of you can almost kind of class this as a sort of a horror film to a certain degree. Early on in the movie, we have this kind of suicide from the original kind of like frontman, and it's very graphic and quite sad. I mean, if I had to critique certain parts of this movie, I would say that I didn't feel that sort of character was kind of fleshed out. I mean, his kind of stage name was Dead, but I didn't feel like we really got to know him at all, to be honest with you. It skips past that bit past very quickly, where I felt like, because he ultimately sort of sets the tone for where the kind of this group of kind of the band and their kind of affiliates ultimately kind of go for, because they feel like that's the stage is set after that, and they have to kind of you know, almost kind of live up to this kind of hype. But I felt like maybe it could have done a little bit more with kind of introducing that character and getting to know him a bit more, because I really didn't feel like it did. But I have to say this movie is very well acted. I mean, it's all set in Norway, but it's an English language film, so that may kind of be a little bit annoying, to be honest with you, because obviously they should all be speaking Norwegian. But they don't. There it is. So, I mean, obviously easy to understand for a Western audience, I suppose, which I'm assuming is the reason for doing it. But nonetheless, it's kind of a little bit less authentic because of that. But I thought the acting here was all very, very good. You know, particularly Rory Culkin, who almost kind of is a kind of a character who kind of starts believing his own hype. But you never really feel he completely commits into all the stuff that he's preaching, but he's the kind of, because he's charismatic, he's kind of influencing these other people to kind of do these kind of like, these very kind of like crazy things that they end up kind of doing. and you know, a lot of the time they're kind of talking about other kind of type of metal poses and stuff like this, but it's kind of you know, hypocrisy to a certain degree, because these guys are just kind of living on their own hype, if that makes sense. So I found it quite fascinating and quite sad, because these characters, you feel like they've kind of you know, have obviously been shunned to somewhat by kind of like society for one reason or another, and ultimately the whole situation that kind of led down, at least according to the film, could have been maybe avoided had you know, had certain things been a little bit different. I thought it's very well acted, and I got to say the actual the kind of prosthetics and the kind of the level of violence here is very real. So it kind of does feel quite shocking when stuff happens, particularly I think because you kind of know this this thing actually happened. Now, I was actually in the heavy metal scene back when this actually happened. I remember reading it in the Kerrang magazine, which was kind of a publication kind of back then, and I was never really into Norwegian black metal, but Steve, who appears on the channel from time to time, is into that, and you know, I remember this was a whole big thing back then. So, you know, this is definitely not for everyone, but I actually thought it was quite a well-made film. I mean, it's apparently not, you know, according to some of the reviews I've read of this, a lot of people say it's not accurate, and it's kind of a lot of this is kind of fabricated. But I did read the kind of the wiki page, and it seemed to kind of, at least the major events here seem to kind of line up to what I've read on there. But you know, like I said, I'm reviewing the film, not the historical event. I mean, maybe the characterizations are different, but who knows? I can only tell you what I see in the film, and I thought it was a well-made film. But it kind of, I feel the pacing of it is a little off. Like I said, it could have had a little bit more characterization on the dead character. That's his name, and then it could have like tied up in the middle a little bit. But it was well acted, well shot, and it's not. I mean, there's like this kind of like this music in it, but it doesn't kind of like, there's not too much of it, which I feel was a decision made to try and make it a little bit more accessible. So if you are a black metal fan, you want to watch this, you may be disappointed with the lack of music in it. I mean, there's a bit, but I feel it does. The decision was made obviously to make it a more commercial, which I feel it probably was the right move in a certain degree. So if you're interested in the heavy metal scene at all, then I would suggest maybe having a look at this one, because you know, it will kind of take you back to the kind of the days of the kind of the early 90s and the late 80s, and what was kind of going on. And I think it's, although it kind of makes it seem like the black metal was just like this huge kind of movement, I mean, unless you were into the scene, you probably have never heard of it. You know, I found the kind of the whole idea of these guys kind of like trying to kind of rebel against what they considered kind of poses and kind of false, you know, somewhat hypocritical ultimately. But there you go. But it was an interesting film. I was enthralled with that. I thought the performances were good. So I want to give this one a 7 out of 10. I actually thought this was kind of a well-made film, but it's worth your time. 7 out of 10 if you've seen it. What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.